Okay, so let's talk about the identifying information section of our report. This is the very first opening section on page 1 of the report. Now, what I recommend is that you use a Microsoft Word table format and input all of this information into a table format. Now, I highly recommend table formatting for your QME report because it serves as a way to present information in a way that's clear and separate and distinct from text information on the page. So it helps this information to stand out as separate and distinct and all related information. So use a Microsoft Word table format or other word processing type of table. And I'll show you how this looks in your report. And I find many doctors do not use a table format. And I think it would help their reports to be clearer and to demonstrate to the parties their attention to detail to use a table format. And I'm sure you'll agree when you see the template that I want to share with you. So in the table, you would include the name of the examinee, their date of birth, and let me give you a couple of reasons why it's important to put the date of birth on the report. And there's a couple of reasons. First of all, it helps to identify the examinee, and it's one more source of identifying information that correlates the named examinee with the actual person involved with the industrial injury. And then there's another reason for those of you who frequently refer your examinees out to imaging facilities for diagnostic studies. Most imaging facilities file cases and images by date of birth rather than by name. Of course, they also file by name, but they prefer the date of birth. That's their primary search. Other scheduling facilities, such as One Call Medical, who are a large provider of diagnostic services here in the state of California, they also use the date of birth as their primary search criteria. So always put the date of birth on the identifying information of the report. Put the claim number, state the name of the employer, add in the examinee's social security number, put down also the date of injury. Include the examinee's driver's license number. And this is something that many doctors have not considered doing, but I recommend it. And you'll recall from earlier in this program, I described a procedure wherein you as the doctor exchange driver's licenses with the examinee. This helps to establish the tone of officiality at the beginning of the face-to-face evaluation. So you've already obtained the examinee's driver's license, and it's at this point in time that you simply type the driver's license number into your identifying information table on page 1 of your QME report. And there's a couple of good reasons for asking for the driver's license. Number one, it helps you to confirm their identity, to make sure that indeed that they are the person who you expect them to be, and that the examinee in front of you is actually the person that you're supposed to be evaluating. Number two, it allows you to confirm their height and weight, and allows you to inquire as to any discrepancies between the height and weight as it appears on the driver's license and the height and weight as the examinee appears before you on the day of the evaluation. And if you note any significant discrepancies, you should inquire as to the source of those discrepancies. Most commonly, discrepancy will involve changes in weight. Typically, examinees gain weight over time, although there are exceptions to this. It also allows you to get some other information that may or may not be useful to you in the process of your evaluation. For example, sometimes we have applicants who drive themselves to the evaluation and yet they're unable to produce a driver's license. In other words, they're an unlicensed driver. This gives you some information. I don't know exactly what you can do with it, but I'll allow you to come up with your own uses for that type of information. For example, you might have an elderly person who gave up their driver's license due to being unable to pass perhaps the driving examination. In that case, the examinee would be unable to produce a valid driver's license, and this gives you information perhaps related to their relevant medical history, which could impact your opinions and conclusions related to the industrial injury. And there's probably other types of information that you can gather from this driver's license procedure, but here I list just a couple. In addition to all of that, you want to obtain a photo, a face shot of your examinee, and you want to include this on page 1 of your Qme report. And this is to identify the examinee along with the date of the evaluation. In other words, you put the date of the evaluation right immediately below the face shot of the examinee. And this identifies the examinee to the parties. And I believe that this is an important procedure, and this procedure will help distinguish your reports from those reports that do not include a photograph of the examinee. And this concept comes under the heading of medical photography. And medical photography is beyond the scope of today's program, but let me just say that in the qualified medical evaluation, there are many instances and many circumstances where a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let me say that again. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and especially if that picture helps support one of your important opinions or conclusions. And let me just give you an example. Let's say you're providing for permanent impairment related to a post-surgical scar. Well, imagine the impact that a clear photo or a series of clear photos depicting this large hypertrophic and keloided scar would have in support of your conclusion for permanent impairment due to a scar. And that's just one example. So the point is, there are many uses and many applications of medical photography. And your medical photography begins with a simple face shot of your examinee on the date of the evaluation on page 1 of your report. And I believe that this is a valuable procedure, and I've been doing this procedure myself for now almost 2 decades. And I've never had any negative input from it, and I've only had positive input from it. I think it's valuable because it allows the parties to place a face with a name. Many times our examinees are simply known as a name, or they're simply known as a claim number, when in actuality they're actually people. And most of them are actually nice people. They're swell people, they're fine people, they're nice people, they're sincere people. And I believe it's important that the parties be able to place a face with a name. In fact, wouldn't it be nice if we as evaluators were able to see a picture of the examinee in advance of our evaluation? It might facilitate our attitude of liberal construction prior to even arriving at the evaluation procedure. So I think it's important, although this is not written anywhere in the AMA guides, I think it's important for the parties to realize that the examinee is a true, live, sincere person, that they have a face, and it's us as the qualified medical evaluators that sometimes gives them their first reminder of this. And we do that reminder by providing them with a photo on page 1 of the report. Number 2 is that taking a photo of the examinee is helpful to us as qualified medical evaluators because it allows you to identify the person if you have to revisit the case at some point later on in time. Let me give you an example of how this could play out. Imagine that you've done a report on Mrs. Jones, and as far as you know, you're done with Mrs. Jones. In other words, you've completed your report, you've provided your opinions and conclusions. As far as you're concerned, that's the last of it. Well, imagine you get a call 2 years later with the claims administrator saying that they need a reevaluation for Mrs. Jones. And you say, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones. I remember the name of Mrs. Jones. Let me see. And you go to your computer and you look up the report of Mrs. Jones, and right there on page 1 of your report is a photo of Mrs. Jones, and immediately you remember Mrs. Jones. And you say, oh, Mrs. Jones, I remember her. Okay, so what's up? We need a reevaluation. And it allows you to identify the person at points later in time if you have to revisit the case, which happens all the time. As you know, it happens all the time. So there are many good reasons for taking a photo of the examinee. Okay, and so what we have here is I've taken a screenshot of the Qme Report Template, and I show here the identifying information exactly as I just described it. So here's a photo of the examinee, and this is just simply a photo of me that I cut and pasted in here. Underneath the photo of the examinee, you put the date that the photo was taken, and then in Microsoft Word table format, you include all of the identifying information in a tabular table format. So you see here that we're here today regarding Tom Smith. Here's the date of birth, claim number, such and such, date of injury, employer, social security number, and California driver's license number. Now, as you look at this identifying information here on this template, what kind of a sense do you get about the quality and the clarity of the report? You can tell that this is a report that's much different than many of the other reports that the claims examiner gets by the hundreds and hundreds. There's extra attention to detail in the form of using a Microsoft Word table. There's extra attention to detail in using a picture of the examinee. So the claims administrator or the attorneys involved can tell right off the bat that this report is special, that this report is clear, that this report is going to be good, that this report is different. And that's how you want to distinguish your reports from the masses that the parties receive on a daily basis. Okay, now the next section in the report is what's going to be referred to as our opening statement and or our introduction. Now, in the opening statement and introduction, we want to handle a couple of the high notes that are required. So, for example, we want to include the date that the appointment call was received. We want to include the date that the appointment was scheduled. The purpose of doing that is to demonstrate to the parties that we complied with timelines related to scheduling the appointment. We want to describe the address of the location of the examination. We want to provide the name and certification number and phone number of any interpreter that may have been present. We want to indicate that we complied with the requirements of Labor Code 4062.3 and CCR 40 A through C with regards to our disclosure requirements. And earlier on in today's program, we went over in great detail the disclosure requirements. So it's at this point in your report where you indicate to the parties that indeed you went through the disclosure requirements with the examinee, and I'll show you how that looks in the report in just a moment. Finally, you want to include the complexity factors that are involved with the billing level of your report. And billing for medical legal reports is described in California Code of Regulations 97/95, which require certain things of us if we are going to bill our reports at the complex levels and above. We have the ML 103 complex and we have the ML 104 complex comprehensive, both of which require specific descriptions and specific explanations from us. And I'll show you how we elaborate on those complexity factors here in our opening statement. Okay, so let's go to our template and review the opening statement and introduction. So here's the identifying information again. We then go past that into our introduction. And let's just see how many of those components that we just discussed and that are required are contained in this introductory section of the report. So this is all templated and can be filled in with specific details as required. So it says here, on such and such date, my office received a telephone call from blank. Now the blank could be the injured worker, could be the claims administrator, could be the applicant attorney. Whoever that is, that name goes in here. Then you say such and such person, maybe it's the injured worker, requested a Qme evaluation and indicated that he selected my name from a panel of 3 doctors that he received from the Industrial Medical Council. He was scheduled for an examination on such and such date at 9:00 a.m. at such and such address, which is input the address of the examination. So here the parties can see, okay, the phone call came in on such and such date. The examinee was scheduled on such and such date. Oh, those 2 dates coincide with 30 to 60 day timelines. So they can confirm that you're in compliance with timelines. On the date of the evaluation, Mr. Jones, who was the examinee, identified himself with a California driver's license. Mr. Jones impressed me with his forthrightness in being a reliable historian and did not appear to magnify his condition or exaggerate in any way. Now, if that does not apply to the examinee in your opinion, you would simply delete that. But it's there for your use should that apply to your examinee. Also present during the evaluation was such and such interpreter of ABC Interpreting Company. Input also the certification number and the phone number. Okay, and then watch this. Prior to the evaluation, I provided Mr. Jones with a copy of the complete text, and this is the prepared statement that we talked about earlier in the program, with a complete copy of the complete text of Labor Code 4062.3E through H and Title 8 CCR 40. I gave him the opportunity to ask questions. I answered all questions prior to proceeding with the evaluation. I conducted every part of the evaluation personally, and face-to-face requirements were met in compliance with Labor Code 139.2J with section number 5, and 5307.6. Total face-to-face time with Mr. Jones was 180 minutes or whatever, and put the time to the exact minute, Then in this section of your introductory remarks is where you would elaborate on the complexity factors that were involved with your report that support your billing level as either an ML102, ML103, or ML104. And we won't go into a lot of detail in this program regarding the complexity factors. We then go into the history section of the report after the introductory remarks. And this is where you elaborate on the facts, which are going to be the pertinent facts that will support your conclusions when you get to important conclusions, perhaps related to permanent impairment or perhaps related to the causation and apportionment of the permanent impairment. And so this is where you start to first mention the important facts upon which your opinions and conclusions rely and are going to be based. And you'll refer to these important facts in many sections later on in your report as you weave internal consistency throughout your report. Now, as we said earlier, the history and the relevant medical history sections of your report are done in 2 sections. And I described earlier in this program important reasons as to why these sections need to be done in 2 separate and distinct sections. You need to do the history and the relevant medical history, number 1, as it's described in the medical records, and then number 2, as it's described by the examinee. And this gives you 2 perspectives, and it allows you to shore up any inconsistencies that you may find either in the medical records or either in the testimony of the examinee. And I elaborated on that at great length earlier in the program, but let's just review how that would look in the context of your Qme report. Okay, so we're back here to our template, and let's go now down to the history of injury section. So in this section, you're going to elaborate on the pertinent facts that will support your opinions and conclusions later on, with special emphasis on the mechanism of injury. So in the first section, you're going to describe the history as it's described in the medical records. And it makes sense to do this in this chronology because frequently and most commonly we get the medical records far in advance of our evaluation of the examinee. So we have a chance to review the medical records and prepare this section of the report here in advance of the face-to-face meeting with the injured worker. So it starts out with some introductory text that's templated. Basically in this section, you want to describe the history of injury as it's described in the medical records, including the findings on diagnostic studies and the treatment history and all that stuff, with special emphasis on the mechanism of injury. And that's something that we referred to earlier, both with regards to the 2001 Physician's Guide and also with regards to the AMA Guide's 5th edition. So special emphasis on the mechanism of injury. And what can I do more to emphasize that idea? Perhaps bold it right there. And then after you get to the face-to-face meeting with your examinee, you give the examinee the opportunity to describe the entire story of the injury, the treatment, and the whole story from inception all the way up to the date of your evaluation. And it's in this section where you would elaborate on any discrepancies or allow Mr. Jones the opportunity to dispute or deny any of the information that was described in the medical records, or even expand upon or further explain. Okay? Same formatting goes with regards to the relevant medical history. You first put the relevant medical history down as is described in the medical records, and review all prior injuries, any settlements, any descriptions from the medical records that remotely relates to the current claim for industrial injury. You'll note that the title is relevant medical history. Not all of their medical history is going to be relevant to the current claim for industrial injury, but for the parts of the medical history that are relevant, you would elaborate on those here. And notice the use of bullets. And the bullets could be used perhaps as follows. Say, for example, the examinee had 2 prior industrial injuries. Well, you might use your bullets as follows. Prior industrial injury, 1998. In 1998, Mr. Jones suffered a lower back injury while working ... and you elaborate on that here. And then the next injury, you might describe it right below that as so in a bulleted format. So this is how you clearly format your report in a way that's in chronologic order, and it's pleasing to the reader's eye, and it's a way that the reader can digest large amounts of information quickly. Okay? So you would do first as it's found in the medical records, and then you would allow Mr. Jones the opportunity to then elaborate on each of those industrial injuries. And again, you would use bullet points. So for example, 1998 industrial injury with Acme Plumbing. So here we said he was working for Acme Plumbing. ... So say, Mr. Jones, I understand in 1998 you had an injury while working for Acme Plumbing. Can you tell me what happened? And he'll tell you. And then he'll tell you about the 2005 industrial injury. And you use bulleted formatting. Okay? So that is the history and the relevant medical history sections of the report. Let's now go on to the review of records. Okay, and now let's finish up now with a discussion about the review of records. And you'll recall that the 2001 Physician's Guide referred to this as sources of information. Sources of information. Well, it's interesting that they would use that term and not go into any great detail as to what's actually required of us in this section of our report. Now, they make a couple of mentions in the 2001 Physician's Guide that we must list our sources, where the information came from, any people that we interviewed or consulted with. Well, in actuality, the requirements of our review of records section are quite clearly laid out both in labor codes and in California codes of regulation. And there's several codes that govern the process involved with review of records. And I want to review this with you here. And then I'll show you how you can format your review of records section in your QME report so that it complies with the related labor codes and regulations. So let's begin with Labor Code Regulation 4062.3D. It says, in any formal medical evaluation, the agreed or qualified medical evaluator shall identify, now this is a key phrase, shall identify, and I'll show you how we identify the information. So the things that we're required to identify include, number one, all information received from the parties, all information reviewed in preparation of the report, all information relied upon in the formulation of his or her opinion. And isn't this interesting that Labor Code 4062.3 hints and alludes to some of the criteria that helps qualify our opinions and conclusions as substantial medical evidence? So later on, when we provide opinions and conclusions, we refer back to the information that we relied upon by citing it and identifying it here under our Review of Records section of our report. Okay, a couple of more codes and regulations. Labor Code 4628.82 requires that the physician review and summarize the prior medical records. So the prior code, 4062.3, required that we identify all information. Well, this code requires that we review and summarize. So what's the difference between identify and review and summarize? Well, I'll talk to you about that a little bit more and show you how to comply with both of those requirements when we get to our template. California Code of Regulation 10606 talks about the physician's report as evidence. It says that these reports, meaning our qualified medical evaluation reports, our reevaluation reports, our supplemental reports, any report that relies on information or any report wherein we received additional information, shall include, where applicable, a listing of all information received from the parties, reviewed in preparation of the report, or relied upon for the formulation of the physician's opinion. And isn't that amazing? It refers to substantial medical evidence, and it requires us here to list it. So far our requirements and obligations involve that we identify all information, that we review and summarize the prior medical records, and that we list all information received and reviewed and relied upon. Interesting. Finally, CCR 41B2 says that all QMEs, regardless of whether the injured worker is represented by an attorney or not, shall review all available relevant medical and non-medical records and/or facts necessary for an accurate and objective assessment of the contested medical issues in an injured worker's case before generating a written report. So when must the medical records be reviewed? When should they be reviewed? Do they have to be reviewed before the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee? No, it doesn't say that. It says, however, that the medical records need to be reviewed before generating a written report. So sometimes doctors will say that they're not able to see the injured worker in the face-to-face evaluation because they have yet to receive the medical records, but there's no provision in the code for that. The only provision is that the medical records be reviewed before the report is generated. And the report must list and summarize. So here we have review and summarize. Here we must list and summarize all medical and non-medical records reviewed as part of the evaluation. So let's review those obligations. 4062.3 says that we must identify all information. 4628 says that we must review and summarize. 10606 says that we must list. And then CCR 41 says we must list and summarize. So we have identify, review, list, and summarize. Identify, review, list, and summarize. Now, of those processes, which of those processes are passive processes and which of those processes are active processes? When it says that we review the records, what does that mean? Does that mean that we read the records? Does that mean that we go through the records and highlight the important components? What does that mean? What does it mean to summarize? What does it mean to list? What does it mean to identify? Well, let's talk about that by going now to our template. Okay, so here we are back at our template, and we're at the review of records section of our report. And I want you to begin this section of your report by indicating to the parties that you're aware of the regulations that govern the review of records section of the report. And I have those regulations listed for you right here. So you demonstrate to your parties your compliance with the regulations by showing them the regulations and then complying with these requirements. So here's Labor Code 4062.3 requires that we identify all the information. 4628 requires that we review and summarize the medical records. 10606 says we should list it. And 41B2 says that we must list and summarize all medical and non-medical records reviewed as part of the evaluation. So you indicate that in compliance with all these codes, below is a listing and a summary of the records that I received, I reviewed, and I relied upon in the preparation of this report. And then here you list how much time was involved in the identification, in a compliance with 4062.3, which requires that we identify. How much time was involved in the listing and review and summary, as is required by 4628, and the listing as is required by 10606. You indicate your time right here in minutes and hours. Well, we then get into our review of records section of our report. And doctors, this section of your report should be a masterpiece. Many doctors complete this section in such a haphazard fashion with no format at all, and it looks terrible. And it represents the doctor in terrible fashion. But I'm telling you, this section of your report should be a masterpiece, because the parties are going to look at this section and see, okay, what is the information that this guy reviewed? What is the information that this gal relied upon? What is the information that this doctor received from the parties? Perhaps there's a document that's missing. If it's not listed and it's an important document, perhaps it's missing. In other words, the parties are going to look at this section and see where your opinions and conclusions are coming from. And this is the section wherein you detail listing and summarizing those pieces of information. So you begin this section by using a table, and the table should list the date of record in chronologic order. Now, doctors, I want to tell you, I can't tell you how many reports I've reviewed and critiqued for QME doctors that list the records not in chronologic order. And that makes absolutely no sense at all, and it looks so disorganized. And it looks terrible, in my opinion. The records should be organized in the date that they occurred chronologically. So, for example, this is January 1st, 2013. We have a record from Greenhouse MD, it is the primary treating physician's progress report. That's a PR2. And then you list, then you summarize the document. Now, doctors, what information do you want to include here in your summary? Is it necessary to retype and reiterate the entirety of the primary treating physician's progress report? No, it is not. But what's important here is that you summarize the information on the document that's important to you, that you are going to later use to rely upon for your opinions and conclusions. So I'm just making this up, but as an example, this could be, current complaints, or I think they call it subjective complaints. Whatever the doctor's commenting on, you might put it right here if it's important to you. Treatment plan, discharge from care without permanent impairment. No further treatment needed. Whatever's on the document that's important to you, that's going to contribute to your opinions and conclusion, goes here. So notice our compliance with the codes of regulation and the labor codes. Here we've identified the information. It's a primary treating physician's report from Greenhouse MD. We've identified it. We've reviewed it and summarized it. So we reviewed it, we read the document, we summarize it here in our own words with the information that's important to us. We listed the information. This is our list. This whole table is our list. And then finally, we listed it and summarized it. So here's our list and here's our summary. And we continue with our review of records in exact same fashion in chronologic order, listing the author, the name of the document or the type of the document, which might be, for example, a doctor's first report of occupational injury or illness. It might be an MRI report, cervical spine. It might be some results of electrodiagnostic studies. Whatever the document is, we list it here, and then we provide relevant details down below in a bulleted list that's clear, that's clearly outlined so that the reader can extract the important information from it quickly. Okay? Down here, include all of the documents that are generated as part of the QME evaluation, such as your own QME intake questionnaire. This would be filled out by Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones gave you a description of job injury, or job duties, I mean. These would all be authored by Mr. Jones. All of the symptom questionnaires that you use, those all get listed through here. And then, if you order diagnostic studies, the results of your diagnostic studies would go right down here. So this might be, for example, San Francisco Radiology Group. Report of findings of lumbar spine MRI. And then summarize the document. You don't have to reiterate the entirety of it. You're going to do that later on in your diagnostic studies section of your report. But here you would simply provide some relevant details that contribute to your opinion. Findings in a bulleted list. L5, S1, broad-based disc protrusion, whatever it is. Make sure all your fonts are consistent throughout. Same type of font, same size of font, using a bulleted list. Impressions. Whatever it is. Okay, doctors? So let me reiterate a couple of comments about the review of records. The review of records is one of the complexity factors under 9795 Code of Regulations. So because it's one of the complexity factors, if you're billing for the higher level of complexity, your review of records section of your report should demonstrate the complexity consistent with your billing level. Let me reiterate that. The review of records section should be consistent in complexity with the complexity that you're billing for under CCR 9795. So because this is one of the complexity factors, this section of your report should be a masterpiece. It should be a brilliant document. It should be in tabular format. It should be in date chronologic order. It should be a bulleted, formatted table. And basically, it should look perfect. It should have no typos. And this is where you will refer back to this section many times as you go through your report, because this helps you identify quickly without having to thumb through the entirety of the medical records. You can refer to this as an index of the medical records and the points that are important to you in the medical records, so that you don't have to yourself go through the entire stack of the medical records when you need to look up an important piece of information. So this section of your report should be a masterpiece. And it's not a section of your report that you simply gloss over or that you complete as an afterthought. This is one of the primary sections of the report, and that fact is governed by codes and regulations. Okay? So, doctors, we're now approaching the 6-hour mark of this program, and I just want to provide you with some conclusions to the program to help summarize what we've reviewed here.